Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're looking at, well, a really extraordinary collection of sources,
Uh-huh.
all focused on just one day, June 23rd, 2025.
Right. A single day.
That's like a snapshot, isn't it?
Yeah.
World in flux. You've got geopolitics,
Lots of things
science.
in between.
Exactly. And our mission, like always, is to pull out the key stuff, the important bits, to give you that shortcut to, really being informed.
And what's so interesting, I think, is how connected it all is. These things that seem separate, we'll try and connect those dots for you, help you understand not just what went down, but why it's important.
What it means for us.
Exactly. The bigger trends it shows us.
Okay, so we really have to start with the biggest headlines from that day, June 23rd, the situation in the Middle East, escalating tensions, then suddenly hope.
It felt like whiplash, didn't it? The world really seemed to be holding its breath.
Absolutely.
And the background here, I mean, these Israel-Iran tensions, they're not new. They're rooted in years of these proxy fights, Iran's nuclear program, of course, and just this really complex web of alliances shifting all over the Middle East.
And the U.S. role.
Well, historically, the U.S. has strongly backed Israel, while also, trying to put a lid on Iran's nuclear ambitions, using diplomacy, sanctions, a mix of tools.
But June 23rd felt different.
Yeah.
Our sources show things really hit a dangerous new point.
They really did. Israel stepped up its attacks, hit some very specific Iranian targets, the Evin prison, which is notorious, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters right in Tehran. Pretty bold,
And Iran's response.
swift, and direct. They launched at least 6 missiles aimed at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That's a key U.S. base there. They even codenamed the operation Glad Tidings of Victory.
Sounds ominous, but...
But, and this is critical, Qatar managed to intercept them. They got advance warning, took them out. The U.S. military reported, some limited damage, but crucially, no fatalities.
Wow.
And that's why military analysts look at this and said Iran's response seemed, calibrated.
Calibrated, meaning...
Meaning designed not to provoke a massive escalation. A signal, maybe, but one that pulled back from the brink of full-scale war, sort of a desire to de-escalate.
And then, almost right after that tension, this surprise announcement felt like it came out of the blue.
It really did. President Trump announced Israel and Iran had agreed to a phased ceasefire,
Wow.
ending what had been a really intense 12-day conflict, which actually kicked off with Israeli strikes back on June 13th.
And Qatar's role.
Key mediator. Sources say they were pivotal in bringing both sides to the table. And then Vice President J.D. Vance came out and emphasized, that U.S. objectives were met, importantly, without American casualties. That was a big talking point for the administration.
Okay, so we go from the brink to a ceasefire in a flash. What does this tell us about, the nature of these conflicts now?
Yeah.
Especially in that region.
Well, beyond the immediate relief, what's really striking is how the global markets reacted.
Right, the money side.
Yeah. You'd expect chaos, right? But after some initial wobbles, they stabilized remarkably quickly once it became clear this wasn't escalating uncontrollably. Oil prices actually dropped over 7%, down to about $68.50 a barrel.
Dropped after missile strikes.
Because the assessment was that Iran's strike was symbolic, calibrated, like we said. De-escalation seemed genuine. And you saw U.S. stock indices surge, the S&P 500 up 1%, the Dow up 0.9, NASDAQ 0.92.
That's counterintuitive.
It shows how markets price in perceived risk. Once the threat seemed contained and de-escalation was underway, confidence returned fast, even though, the UN had warned about a spiral of chaos and held an emergency meeting.
So the markets bought the de-escalation narrative.
Largely, yes. Although, there were skeptics, plenty of lingering distrust. Iran hinted they'd keep their program going. Israel was cautious. NATO, the EU, they welcomed the truce, but warned, look, real peace needs serious diplomatic follow-through. This isn't over.
A fragile truce, then. And internationally, beyond the markets and the UN, Russia had some strong words.
They did. President Putin called the initial U.S. strikes on Iranian sites unjustified and a serious escalation, said it pushed the world to a very dangerous line.
Taking a clear stance there.
Very clear. And China urged restraint from everyone involved, pushing for diplomacy as usual.
And sticking with Iran for a moment, there was another related development around that time, something about a vital shipping lane.
That's right, the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's parliament passed this resolution. It was technically on the 22nd, but making waves on the 23rd. Non-binding, mind you, but calling for closure of the strait if Iran felt threatened further.
And that's a huge deal economically.
Massive. You're talking about, what, 20% of global LNG? 25% of oil exports goes
Wow.
right through there. Experts at places like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan were warning, look, if they actually did block it, catastrophic oil price spikes, massive trade disruption, could even trigger military action.
So even with the ceasefire, that threat is kind of hanging there, a reminder of the economic leverage.
Exactly, a major vulnerability in the global system.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Beyond the Middle East crisis, June 23rd also saw some interesting diplomatic moves and some really significant legal rulings, especially here in the U.S. Let's touch on NATO first.
Right, the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague, scheduled for June 24th, 25th. It's actually the first time the Dutch are hosting, and it's under the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte.
And the agenda sounds ambitious.
Very. A big push for members to hit 5% of GDP on defense spending.
5%. That's way up from the old 2% goal.
See, it's a huge jump, signals a real shift in perceived threat levels, I think. They're also talking heightened collective defense, basically, how to react faster together, especially against what they term Eurasian threats.
Yeah.
And boosting military production capacity.
Who's expected there?
Key leaders. Polish President Duda, U.S. President Trump. It's set to be a pretty high-stakes meeting.
Okay, and connecting to alliances. Something interesting for our Canadian listeners happened on the 23rd. Prime Minister Carney, EU defense deals. What's the significance?
Yeah, this is quite notable for Canada. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced these new agreements to deepen security and defense procurement ties, specifically with the European Union.
So buying more European kit, working closer together.
Essentially, yeah. Streamlining joint projects, making it easier to work together, strengthening Canada's ability to respond to threats. It's being framed as a significant shift in Canada's foreign policy.
Why is it significant? A move away from the U.S. focus.
Perhaps diversification is a better word. Building stronger bridges with Europe on defense, not necessarily away from the U.S., but certainly adding another strong pillar to their foreign policy. It's interesting.
From alliances to human rights. Belarus also made headlines that day.
Yes, a positive development mostly. The release of opposition leader Sergei Tikhanovsky.
Ah, I remember his case.
Right. Him and over a dozen other political prisoners were let go. This apparently followed direct negotiations with the United States.
And Tikhanovsky.
He was reunited with his family, who've been living in exile in Lithuania. Human rights groups, Western governments, they welcomed it, called it a positive step. But, with caveats.
Caveat likes.
Like, Belarus's overall human rights record is still deeply troubling. This is one good step, but there's a long way to go. And Tikhanovsky himself immediately called on Belarusians to keep resisting authoritarian rule. So the fight for democracy there, far from over.
Understood. Okay, let's pivot to the U.S. domestic scene now. A major Supreme Court ruling on immigration grabbed headlines.
It did. The Supreme Court basically gave the green light for the Trump administration to resume deportations to third countries while the legal challenges are still ongoing.
So lifting the pause that a lower court had put in place.
Exactly. And this immediately ignited, well, a fierce debate. Critics are saying this violates international asylum protections. Supporters argue it's necessary for border security, deterring illegal entry. Very divided views.
And the impact on the ground.
Sources reported immigrants feeling real fear, changing daily routines in cities across the U.S. We saw examples cited like a father of 3 U.S. Marines detained in L.A., a teen athlete deported from Ohio. These stories personalize the policy.
And the reaction.
Civil rights groups are ramping up criticism. Law enforcement and the administration, they're sticking to the border security argument. It's a real point of tension.
This tension between government policy and individual lives, individual rights. It seems to be a theme.
Yeah.
We saw it in education, too, with Texas.
We did. Texas became the largest state mandating the display of the Ten Commandments in all public school classrooms. Governor Abbott signed that bill into law.
Even though a similar law in Louisiana was just struck down.
That's right. A federal appeals court called Louisiana's law plainly unconstitutional. But Texas is pushing ahead.
So the arguments are?
Supporters say it promotes moral values. Critics say it's a clear violation of the separation of church and state.
And this is heading for the courts, presumably.
Almost certainly. Legal challenges are expected, and yeah, this looks likely to end up back at the Supreme Court. Could set a major national precedent on religion in schools.
It's fascinating how these policies touch on such fundamental societal debates. Values, freedom.
Yeah.
And that connects to healthcare access too, right? Telemedicine and abortion access.
Absolutely. A new study dropped on June 23rd showing that now 1 in 4 abortions in the U.S. is provided via telemedicine.
1 in 4. Wow. How does that work?
Doctors in states where abortion is legal are increasingly prescribing abortion medication remotely. Patients in states with bans or heavy restrictions can consult online and get the medication mailed to them, bypassing state laws and potential prosecution.
Circumventing bans, essentially.
That's the effect, yes.
Yeah.
And again, sharply divided opinions. Supporters say this expands access dramatically, protects privacy. Opponents raise legal and ethical flags, patient safety, jurisdictional issues across state lines. It's another battleground.
These societal debates are intense. And overlaying all of this, of course, is the environment. Climate change was very present on June 23rd, both in terms of impact and maybe some innovation.
Very present, yes. Stark reminders. A brutal heat wave hit the central and eastern U.S. We're talking Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Philly, New York, KC, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, D.C.
Huge area.
Huge. And also large parts of Europe, France, the UK, Northern Europe. Record highs over 100 Fahrenheit, heat indices near 115, just dangerous heat.
And the response?
Health officials issued urgent warnings: hydrate, stay cool. Cooling centers open for vulnerable people. And the experts are clear: expect more of this. Global warming is driving these extremes. It renews those calls for climate action, sure, but also for adaptation. How do we live with this?
And it wasn't just heat, was it? Other severe weather, too?
No, definitely not just heat. North Dakota got slammed. Multiple tornadoes and a derecho.
A derecho, remind us.
It's like a line of severe thunderstorms, but it travels really fast over a long distance, bringing widespread damaging winds. Caused major damage, power outages. Tragically, 3 people died there.
Awful. And elsewhere.
New York saw flash flooding and a tornado. Also, 3 fatalities, including 2 children. Tens of thousands lost power. And out west, southern Utah, a lightning strike sparked a wildfire that destroyed at least 14 homes, forced hundreds to evacuate.
Just devastating impacts across the board.
Absolutely. State governments declared emergencies, mobilized resources, but these events inevitably reignite those debates. Are we prepared? Is our infrastructure resilient enough? And fundamentally, what are we doing about climate change?
Heavy stuff. But you mentioned innovation, too. Amidst all this, some positive scientific news broke on the 23rd.
There was some really exciting news, yes. A bit of hope. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory down in Chile released its first official images.
The new big telescope.
Exactly. And the images were apparently stunning. Distant stars, nebulas, they mentioned deep looks at the Virgo cluster, the Trifid and Lagoon nebulae galaxies, all with unprecedented detail.
Amazing. Any discoveries?
They announced detecting over 2,100 new asteroids right off the bat.
Wow.
Scientists are calling it historic. They expect breakthroughs in studying dark matter, mapping our solar system better, catching transient events in the sky. And importantly, the data is open access for researchers globally.
That's great. Collaboration.
Yeah, should really accelerate things.
And closer to home, you mentioned something about carbon emissions. A potential breakthrough.
Yes, this came out of the University of Michigan. Researchers announced a new method they've developed for converting carbon dioxide.
The greenhouse gas.
Right. Converting CO2 into solid metal oxalates, basically locking the carbon away in a stable, solid form.
So taking CO2 out of the air or industrial processes and turning it into...
Exactly. It could help industries cut their emissions and potentially create valuable materials from what's currently waste gas.
Sounds promising. Is it ready to go?
Well, the usual caveats apply. More research needs to be scaled up, but it's definitely an innovative approach. Offers some hope for greener industry down the line.
And speaking of climate tech, AI is getting involved in forecasting now, too.
It is. A new AI model called Aurora was unveiled on June 23rd.
Aurora. And what can it do?
It's designed for climate forecasting, predicting hurricanes, air quality, ocean conditions. And the claim is it does this with unprecedented accuracy.
Better than current models.
That's the suggestion. The hope is it'll boost early warning systems, improve how we respond to extreme weather, give people more time to prepare.
Makes sense. Any concerns?
Governments and environmental groups seem pretty welcoming, but some experts do caution, about becoming too reliant on AI for something this critical. Need to understand its limitations, too.
Always a balance. Okay, let's shift focus again, maybe towards the economy and some cultural highlights from June 23rd. What was the economic pulse check?
Well, Fannie Mae released its updated economic outlook. They're projecting moderate GDP growth, 1.4% for 2025, picking up to 2.2% in 2026.
Okay, so growth but not booming.
Pretty much. And importantly, for many people, they expect mortgage rates to stay elevated. They actually lowered their forecasts for home sales. Affordability is still a major issue.
And inflation.
Still a concern. They see the consumer price index rising 3.2% in 2025. So the overall picture is one of cautious optimism, as they put it. Growth, yes, but persistent challenges, especially in housing.
Got it. Okay, beyond the economy, sports and education had some moments.
They did. Big news in the NBA. The Oklahoma City Thunder won their first ever championship on June 23rd.
Right, and led by a Canadian star.
Exactly. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, his performance all season, especially in the playoffs, had people making comparisons, some of the all-time greats. Huge celebrations in OKC, obviously, but also back in his hometown, Hamilton, Ontario.
Nice crossover story. What else?
On the education front, Purdue University got a pretty high ranking, first among U.S. public universities, sixth globally in this global university visibility list. Measures media presence, research impact, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute landed a massive research contract from the Department of Defense. $1.5 billion.
Wow. For what?
Advanced software prototyping, specifically for national security, a big investment in U.S. software capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Also, June 23rd was International Olympic Day. The theme was, Let's Move, promoting health and engagement ahead of the Paris 2024 Games. Oh, wait, that should be the upcoming Olympics, maybe 2028 Games contextually. Let's assume it means the next Olympics.
Well, I promoted the Olympic spirit.
Exactly. And a quick note on college sports. The Pac-12 Conference announced a media deal with CBS, looking ahead to its revamp in 2026 with Mountain West teams joining. And on the same day, Fresno State got 4 football recruits to commit verbally. So movement there, too.
Okay, quite a mix. But we also need to touch on a couple of more somber or concerning local and international items from that day.
Unfortunately, yes. Back in Hamilton, Canada, where they were celebrating Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, there was also difficult news. Police charged a suspect in the abduction and suspected murder of a local woman who had been missing.
Oh, that's awful, the community reaction.
Described as heartfelt relief that someone was charged, mixed with profound grief for the victim. Just a tragic situation.
And internationally. Panama?
Yes, the Panamanian government declared a state of emergency in one province, Bocas del Toro. This came after 2 months of protests and road blockades by workers.
Protesting what?
They were demonstrating against the Chiquita company, the banana giant, accusing them of exploitative practices, mass firings. Declaring a state of emergency meant suspending constitutional protections in that area, a pretty serious step pointing to ongoing labor struggles.
Wow. June 23rd, 2025. What a day when you lay it all out. From the edge of war in the Middle East and a sudden ceasefire to amazing views from space, AI climate models, Supreme Court rulings, local tragedies, sports triumphs.
It really underscores how much can happen in just 24 hours, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And how interconnected it all is, the global and the local, the political and the personal, conflict and innovation.
It really does.
And it raises, I think, a really important question for all of us navigating this flood of information. In an era where things move so incredibly fast, how do we do more than just skim the headlines?
Mm-hmm.
How do we as citizens trying to stay informed figure out not just what's happening, but what really matters? What are the deeper implications for our future? How do we truly understand the currents shaping our world?
That's a great question to leave folks with, something to definitely mull over. As always, we hope this deep dive helps you navigate some of those currents, helps you feel, a bit more deeply informed.
We hope so.
Thanks so much for joining us for this exploration.